All right there, econ friends. Welcome back to our finally, our final video in our resource and labor market discussion. So in earlier videos, we set the stage by analyzing resource markets in context and supply and demand, etc. In our last video, we did a bit of an extension. We took a look at how unions and the actions of unions can be analyzed through an economic context. In this final video, I want to take our labor market knowledge, our resource market knowledge, and do a second extension. Okay, so again, in the previous video, we did an extension to investigate unions. In this video, what I want to do is I want to do a final extension to analyze something that is increasingly visible, increasingly important, and increasingly politically charged in our current environment. And that is the idea of earnings differences. Okay? At its core, understanding the forces of labor market supply and labor market demand, understanding your labor market economics can help you to make sense of this critical idea, increasingly important politically and socially, of earnings differences among people. And the reality is, my friend, earnings differences are always present. They always have been, they always will be, okay? My goal in this video is to get you to be thinking about this from a very critical, deep lens that is rooted in economic thinking. Not reactionary thinking, not sloppy thinking, but detailed economic supply and demand thinking. Okay? But it's important that you think about this because the reality is, again, like I said, earnings have always differed among groups of people. Okay, we see today, right here, right now, that the earnings of people within the same industry or with the same amount of education, they often differ substantially. We see that people who have similar intelligence or levels of training or experiences have wage differentials. And the key question here is why? Now, you're going to be able to pull explanations from lots of different fields. Politicians have their own set of explanations and reasonings. So do other people in different fields. What I'm looking at here, though, is how economists think. And what I really want you to pull from this is an economic way of thinking about earnings differences. At their core, economists have offered several explanations for wage and earnings differentials. Let's go through a few of them. And by the way, some of the stuff that we're going to discuss in here and cover, it's going to be a little bit touchy and a little bit sensitive as we talk about the fact that some people are simply more intelligent than others or have more motivation than others, or as we kind of get into thinking about economic discrimination based on gender or race, okay? We're going to attack these things rationally and with respect, but grounding them, not in the reactionary way that politicians think or that others think, but in a very sober, detailed, and analytical economic framework. So what are some of the explanations that economists have given? Well, number one, and probably the biggest one, worker skill level. Okay, you guys know from earlier videos that the demand for employees who are highly productive, okay, remember our old concept of the marginal physical product of labor, the MPP, the demand for employees who are highly productive is far greater than for those who are less productive. And the reality is, things like education and human capital will directly impact productivity and therefore directly influence wages. And the reality is, my friends, that different people simply have different skill levels. These skill levels can be tied to lots of different causes, education and background, if you grew up with wealth or without wealth, things like age and how long have you been working. Obviously, older workers who work for a longer time have a different set of skills and a way of knowing how to work that's going to make them more productive. So there's lots of different contributing factors that can cause differential skill levels, but that's critically a major determinant of wage differences. And we can actually take a look at this. Look at this nifty supply-demand graph. What we've done here is we've taken a traditional labor supply and demand graph. We have wages up on this axis and quantity of labor on this axis. But note that what we've done here is we've put surgeons as an example and teachers as another example on the same graph. And when you take a look at it that way, when you take a look at people in different occupations in the same graph, you get some pretty important conclusions. We see, for example, that surgeons typically have higher marginal revenue products and that there's far fewer surgeons. It's much harder to get into than teaching. Teachers, on the other hand, typically have lower marginal revenue products, and there's a higher supply of teachers. The reality is, it is simply easier to get a job as an elementary or middle school teacher than to get a job as a surgeon. Notice again, my friends, we are not saying that teachers suck and that surgeons are great. We're making no judgments on the work that is done. We're simply looking at the supply and demand dynamics of these different occupations. And when you factor in that surgeons have a higher marginal product and a lower supply, it's predictable that their equilibrium wage rate will be far different than teachers who have a lower marginal revenue product and a much higher supply, because it's much easier to be a teacher. They're going to have a different equilibrium point that's going to correspond to a lower wage rate. Note that this is not evidence in any way of discrimination in the workplace. Note that this is simply looking at our supply and demand of labor, our marginal revenue product, as well as how tough it is to get a job, and making sober economic decisions that way, okay? So worker skill level. Another thing that is important to bring up here is a little subset of this. And I want to introduce you to an idea known as tournament pay. Tournament pay refers to a form of compensation in which the top performer, or like the top performers, they receive significantly higher rewards than other competitors, even if the other performers are only slightly lower in their level of performance. Okay, so what I'm saying here is this. We've established the fact that worker skill level can lead to income differentials. Add to that this idea of tournament pay. And what I'm saying here, okay, so tournament pay again refers to, think about a tournament. In a tournament, we call this winner take all. Oops, not winner take it, sorry, winner take all. Imagine a tournament, a golf tournament, a boxing tournament, a sports tournament, any kind of tournament. You're going to have people with fairly equal skills competing, but the winner of the tournament, even if that winner's skills are just only a little bit higher than the jabroni who got second place, the winner is going to get the bulk of the rewards, sometimes all the rewards. You know, look at a golf tournament, look at a wrestling tournament, look at a competitive tournament of most types. The gap between the first place and the second place guy, tiny. Their skill levels, tiny differences. Yet the nature of the compensation in a tournament pay setup means that the winner is going to get almost all the rewards. Well, one thing that we're seeing today, my friends, in our modern economic industrial society is that increasing numbers of occupations are shifting in subtle ways into tournament pay structures. Think about professional athletes. The difference between a Major League Baseball player and a guy in AAA skill-wise is negligible. Yet look at the massive difference in the rewards that professional baseball players get at the Major League level versus the AAA level. Think about movies and entertainment. Clearly tournament pay, winner take all models dominate. There's a handful of actors that can generate salaries of $20 million per film. Those actors may not be, but just a little bit better than the next tier of actors. But that little bit of extra skill that those top actors have in a tournament pay, winner take all setting mean that the best actors take the huge salaries. And even a little jump down in skill level down to tier 2, you're not making anything. We see tournament pay in professional sports. We see it in entertainment. We increasingly see it in the world of technology and software design. We see it in entrepreneurship, where the best entrepreneurs who form the best tech companies not walk away because they work hard for it. They earn billions of dollars, while just slightly less skilled entrepreneurs don't. We see this in the legal profession with the best lawyers making vast amounts of money. We see it in banking. So we're seeing in increasing areas of our life tournament pay, AKA winner take all models. Note again that these models simply exacerbate and magnify the wage differentials that are tied to skill level, okay? The second thing, which is somewhat similar to the first one, talent and ability. The reality is some workers just have different abilities, different talents. And if you're mismatched with your job, you're going to be less productive and make less money. A third explanation that economists give for wage differentials is worker preference and the idea of compensating differentials. When you look at this factor, what's really important to understand is that ultimately people have different objectives in life. All of us are different. We're unique people. We have different goals in life. And that oftentimes these different goals are going to extend into the areas of labor and work and money and skill development. All of us have different goals in life, and therefore all of us will probably view work slightly differently. Some of us may be real workaholics who want to work 70 hours a week and make a lot of money. Others of us may want more of a balance. These things may also change as your life cycle changes, as maybe you move into a family life. You say, oh, I want to cut back on hours. Although some people say, I have a family, I want to work more hours. But the underlying reality here is that people have different objectives in life. Here's what's really important to understand. Again, in economics, we distinguish between the positive and the normative. Positive economics is what is, and normative economics is what people think what should be, okay? We're going to focus on positive economics. We're not making value judgments here. But critically, and again, I want to make sure that you understand, economics does not dictate that one set of preferences is better than another. Economics does not dictate that being a workaholic is better or worse than being a slacker, okay? Economics makes no judgment as to which preference is better than another. However, what economics does recognize, what economics does see as true, is simply this reality. Other things held constant, right? Ceteris paribus, people who are more motivated by monetary objectives, people who have a life preference toward making more money, they are more likely to do the things that will generate those higher wage rates. Go to higher ranked colleges, study more difficult degrees, engage in more training, work more hours. You get the idea. Again, economics makes no distinction as to which preference is better or worse. We simply point out that some people whose life preferences draw them to more monetary objectives, they're going to do things, they're going to be incentivized to take steps, to educate themselves, to invest in themselves, to generate those higher wages. It's not good. It's not bad. It just is. Okay. Another thing that is tied to the idea of worker preference is that some people will have preferences for work that is more unpleasant, more dangerous, more undesirable. Okay, there simply are some people who are drawn more to jobs that generate comfort, and other people who are drawn to jobs that generate risk. There's going to be some workers who say, I want a job where I'm never going to get hurt, where I'll be comfortable, I'll be in an air-conditioned office and my hands won't get cut up. And other workers who are going to be drawn to occupations that are inherently unpleasant or dangerous or somehow undesirable. An important term that you need to know in economics is the idea of compensating differential. A compensating differential refers to the additional income that workers are paid in order to compensate them for the risk, the danger, the unpleasantness, or the undesirable aspects of a job. Again, what we're trying to understand here is why some workers make more or less than other workers. One explanation that economists have given is that worker preferences differ. And when you factor in the idea of compensating differentials, it seems pretty clear that workers who are drawn to more dangerous, more dirty, more risky jobs will probably make more money than those who are not, because bosses have to pay them more money. You can also see it on a supply-demand analysis, right? Ugly, dirty, risky jobs, they're going to have a very low supply. Low supply, higher price, higher pay, okay? So that was number 3. The fourth thing, which we discussed last time that can change incomes, would be unions, and we learned about the reasons why. The fifth thing that economists have offered as an explanation for earnings differentials is race and gender. And tied to that is the idea of discrimination. Economists do believe and do recognize that discrimination on the basis of race or gender can contribute to earnings differences. However, this one gets a little bit tricky and a little bit sensitive, because one of the problems around this is the idea of accurate measurement. So the question that comes up when you're looking to analyze the impact of race or gender on earnings differences is, how do you measure it? We believe that we're going to call this multivariate, that there are multiple variables that can cause income differences, like ones we just discussed up here. So if you are doing good economic analysis, trying to understand the impact of discrimination and race and gender on earnings differences, one thing that you have to do is really focus on appropriate measurement. And specifically, when you're looking at the impact of discrimination on wage differences, good economic analysis requires that you isolate the impact of discrimination by taking account for other differences. In other words, if you're going to take a look at differences in wage that are caused by income or race by race or gender discrimination, you first need to pull out, right? Separate out, account for other variables, things like education or experience or age or any other productivity related factor. Good economic analysis says you account for those factors first. You pull those factors out and account for them. And then once you've accounted for those factors, which we know can contribute to differentials, you then make comparisons between similarly qualified groups. If you're able to isolate, and if you're able to pull out and isolate all the other variables, then you can make comparisons between similarly qualified groups who only differ with regard to race and gender. And that's how you determine the actual economic impact on wages of racial or gender discrimination. Okay. Note that it's very hard to do because measurement is always an issue. But professional economists do it. And they use really advanced mathematics and advanced modeling to pull out those non-gender and non-race effects, isolate them, and then make their conclusions. And that's what good analysis is. It's not being reactionary, being thoughtful, deliberate, using the tools of our discipline. Okay. Number 6, worker attitudes. This is somewhat related, but slightly different than skill. But basically, at the end of it, attitudes can also influence productivity. I'm sure in your classes, you've dealt with classmates on group projects who have different attitudes toward the project, and it affected how well the project went. Worker attitudes, factors like dependability and persistence and creativity, things like reliability, desires to learn, and critically in today's economic systems, the ability to work in teams. Those are critical attitudes that can increase or decrease productivity, which, as you know, in turn increases or decreases wages. Okay. So worker attitudes are really important. And the final one that economists point out are institutional barriers. Institutional barriers that basically limit the ability of workers to enter into occupations. One of the biggest culprits in this is the idea of licenses and licensing requirements. You would be shocked if you were to do some research and determine the number of occupations in which you are required to get additional education and get a license in order to do it. At the risk of going from positive into normative economics, we really feel that lots of industries are overregulated by really stringent licensing requirements. Ironically, whenever industries put licensing requirements into play, they always sell it as this is for consumer safety. You have to have a license to cut hair to protect consumer safety. You have to have a license to give manicures to protect consumer safety. I have to have a license to do taxes to protect consumer safety. But when you really look at it, if you look at the economics, it's oftentimes not about consumer safety. Oftentimes, the licensing requirements are not pushed through by consumer groups, but they're pushed through by existing workers in an industry. Because if existing workers in an industry can put up onerous licensing requirements, you have to go to more school, you have to pay high fees to get your license, that's basically a way to block new people from entering the industry, which, as you can now tell, would work to artificially suppress supply, keep people out, and give the people who are already existing in the industry artificially high wages. Okay, so this is another example of a cause of wage differentials. Institutional barriers that basically keep people from moving into some occupations. The biggest culprit here, licensing requirements. from now on, as you look at the real world around you and you look at licensing requirements, you have to have a license to be, you have to have a license to be a tax preparer, some places make you get licenses to be a pet groomer, to give manicures, to give haircuts. Don't think for a minute that these things are about consumer safety. They're barriers to entry so that existing classes of workers can box out other people. This is the reason why when you dig into the sponsors of most licensing requirements, it's existing firms who have a massive incentive to make entering into an industry painful or complicated or expensive. And that's another reason for wage and income differentials, okay? Which is ironic because, again, government would often say that government is designed to help people, yet we can now see that overregulation and overly intrusive government policies like licensing can actually exacerbate wage gaps and hurt people, okay? And with that, my friends, we are done at long last with our discussion on labor and resource markets. Congratulations. Thanks for sticking through this with me. At this point now, you are well versed in the economics of labor markets, and hopefully I've been able to get you to use that knowledge and make some extensions by looking at how unions operate and by really analyzing some of the many factors that make this person earn more than that person. As always, I thank you guys for tuning in. I'll see you next time.